The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then Jesus sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. The Gospel of the Lord. We're pretty sure that St. Mark wrote the first gospel. It's shorter than all the rest and simpler than the rest. He put a pretty simple geographical pattern on it. He started with the baptism of Jesus, not too long an account of that. And then he put the ministry of Jesus in the northern Galilee district of the country, the area where Jesus grew up. And then he had to make a journey through Samaria, the mountainous region, heading south to Jerusalem, the capital city. And then the final part of Jesus' life and his death and his resurrection took place there in Jerusalem. Both St. Matthew and St. Luke basically followed that same pattern, but they added a whole lot more material to it. And today we see a very critical point that was reflected in Mark's Gospel and is even sharpened, I would say, in St. Matthew's Gospel. It's the point where Jesus turns from the ministry in the north and heads towards Jerusalem, where he will suffer and die. He comes into the district of Caesarea Philippi, at the very south of the north. Just a complicated way of putting it, but just before passing over into the mountainous Samaritan region. One has to pretty much go through Caesarea Philippi before one gets to Samaria and eventually on to Jerusalem. And so he asks his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" That expression, the Son of Man, is interesting. In its simplest understanding, it's just like a way of saying a human being, a son or a daughter of humanity. There's a way in which the prophet Ezekiel is often referred to that way. But in the way Jesus uses it, it's much more likely to be reflecting a passage from the book of Daniel, the prophet Daniel, when he describes a vision in the night with one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven at the time of the great judgment and presenting everything before his Father. And so Jesus chooses to refer to himself almost exclusively with this title, the Son of Man, probably his way of identifying himself with that passage from chapter 7 of the book of Daniel. And so they answer. We don't know who they are, some of his disciples and apostles. Some say John the Baptist, the great voice crying out in the wilderness, the one who called people to baptism, a washing away of their sins, the one who had baptized Jesus himself, even though John didn't think it was such a smart idea. He thought the role should be reversed, but Jesus would have nothing to do with that. By this time, John the Baptist has been put to death. And so some think, well, maybe the spirit of John the Baptist is now acting in Jesus. But others say Elijah. Well, Elijah was a prophet from the 9th century BC. And so I don't think they were suggesting that all of a sudden after 9 centuries he rose from the dead and reincarnated in Jesus, but that prophetic spirit with which he tried to fight for the God of Israel in the 9th century BC is now acting in Jesus. Others said Jeremiah. Jeremiah, a great prophet from the 6th century BC, right up to the time of the Babylonian exile, who did everything he could to call the people back to God when he could see this great exile coming, and who was carried off against his will into Egypt and not into exile, and who died there, was buried and no one knows where, but after that was recognized as one of the greatest of the prophets of Israel. Or others thought, well, maybe it was one of the other prophets. So somehow they're seeing a prophetic spirit, whether one they've maybe themselves witnessed or heard of, John the Baptist, or those that they knew through their sacred scriptures. But Jesus isn't satisfied. Who do you say that I am? It's Simon Peter who answers. And note, Simon, that was his birth name, the name that would have been given to him by his father on the 8th day after his birth when he was circumcised. And then Peter, which is a bit of an anachronism here because it's a couple of verses before he's given the name Peter by Jesus. He answers, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." The Christ, in Greek, ho Christos, in Hebrew, Mashiach, the Messiah, the Christ. Both those words mean the anointed one. The Jews were expecting and longing for an anointed one, a Messiah. And so now Simon Peter is suggesting, you are the Messiah. But then he goes further, the Son of the living God. Maybe he's been reflecting, why does Jesus keep on calling himself the Son of Man? Is he saying that he is the one who will come on the clouds of heaven and present everything back to his Father? And Jesus answers him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah." Jonah would have been his father. "For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter." It wasn't a proper name. It's the word for the rock, as we all learned in catechism. "You are the rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." And then in a continuation, reminiscent of the passage which was tonight's first reading, speaking of an official of the government, the king, official of the king of Judea in the time of Isaiah the prophet. "I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And then, strangely, Jesus sternly orders his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. It's not, and this is probably something more coming from Mark, it's not until Jesus actually gets to Jerusalem and he is arrested and tried and crucified and put to death. It's only then that they'll really be able to understand what these words mean. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.